Hi, in this lecture I want to talk a little bit about Byzantine art. This is art that comes from the culture that arises in what was originally the eastern part of the Roman Empire, starting in the 4th century and centered on the city of Constantinople, what was once known as Byzantium and today is called Istanbul. And so I primarily want to focus on art from the region of Constantinople itself and some of the best preserved examples of it that lie well to the west of that in the city of Ravenna in Italy, when the reach of the Byzantine Empire went considerably into Western Europe. So what I want to begin with is just a quick look at some early examples of art from Ravenna, going back really to the 5th century, and looking in particular at the so-called Mausoleum of Galla Placidia. And what we're looking at here is the interior of it, a very small space, but one that is covered from floor to ceiling with extraordinary mosaic decoration, among the most famous of which is this figure right here, Christ as the Good Shepherd, again from the first few decades of the 5th century. This is a really splendid image, really radiant and reflecting, and this is, I think, pretty important for thinking about Byzantine art, reflecting great familiarity with the classical idiom of art, especially painting and its translation to mosaic. So there's a strong sense of light, a strong sense of modeling and volume. Christ, of course, is resplendent in his gold and purple robe, reflecting the likely imperial origins of this structure and its function. Mosaic, of course, is a radiant and shimmering medium upon which to work, but one also that is fragmented and fundamentally two-dimensional in nature. And I think there's little doubt that within the Byzantine tradition of picture making, mosaic occupies a very high place indeed. So this gives us a sense of where the priorities of early Christian art and by extension Byzantine art are headed. If we look at examples of Byzantine art proper, which is to say things that we might see sponsored by the emperor in Constantinople, for instance, we might look at luxury items like this, for instance, ivory carving here of Saint Michael the Archangel. We start seeing some things that are definitely departing from the classical norm. A good example of this would be the way in which this particular figure both creates a plausible three-dimensional standing human figure, but also in a peculiar sense dissociates itself from the setting, so that, for instance, the figure's feet, St. Michael's feet, don't bear any clear articulated relationship to the stairs upon which he stands. And I think that this is significant, the sense of not necessarily being interested in integrating the figure properly within its surroundings is a hallmark, really, of a developing Byzantine style. In this particular image here, the so-called Barberini ivory, we get a sense of this new integration of secular and religious in the form of the emperor, who acts as a kind of Caesar slash Pope, who has control both in the secular sense of the empire, but also in a religious sense, and is directly involved in the religious life, essentially, of the empire. Again, like the previous image we saw of St. Michael, this is executed in ivory and bears a number of hallmarks of its Roman, the culture's Roman origins, the equestrian statue and the figures in the panel directly above him. One of the things that Justinian is particularly well known for, and is really one of the most famous figures, I think, in ancient history, is his architecture, his achievements in architecture. And the Hagia Sophia is a great example of this, a sort of capital church, if you will, in the heart of Constantinople. This is a spectacular combining of traditional architectural forms from Rome, the basilica and the dome, creating a complex and multifaceted, especially interior space, very suitable for the Eastern Church's liturgy and sort of ritual ceremony. As we look at the inside, and particularly in a good photograph such as this one right here, we can see how ingeniously the architects have created a dome seated on top of a broader longitudinal structure by means of pendentives, these sort of circular triangular forms that help ease the transition from the dome, the circular area of the dome, into the more square area of the main space, the basilica sort of form. And even more spectacularly, of course, the architects have penetrated the base of the dome with a series of windows to give the sense of a lighter than air, kind of floating feeling to the whole structure. So Byzantine architecture tends to have this less easily understood, less rational, I suppose, initial impression, one that focuses more on a kind of light-filled, mystical experience. And this is echoed to a certain degree in the structure to the west, that of San Vitale in the city of Ravenna, which, as I've mentioned before, has a good deal of Byzantine architecture and art. The interior, let me just focus on the interior, is definitely based upon a dome, an octagonal dome, and is decorated extensively, again with mosaic decorations that emphasize, as we see on the panels that are directly adjacent to the altar, emphasizes this relatively two-dimensional aspect of Byzantine art that I've already pointed out before. And among the most famous examples of Byzantine art is this scene here of Justinian, along with the local bishop Maximianus, seen here basically officiating at the communion. He's in the center holding this paten, the container for the bread. Maximianus is here, and a very interesting kind of mingling of church and the figures of the clergy to the side, and of course state in the forms of the soldiers, one of whom carries a shield bearing the famous Chi-Rho, going all the way back to the era of Constantine. So if we look a little closer at the figures themselves, we can see how they have a certain degree of two-dimensionality to them, the way in which they overlap, the sense of distance and really no real connectedness between head and body, and of course that relatively abstract gold and green background that makes it difficult for us to really very clearly see where they exist in space. Even more controversial and startling in many ways than the juxtaposition of church and state with Justinian is the presence of his queen, Theodora, officiating also at this scene. This is a little bit more complicated with a little bit of architecture thrown in here. To Theodora, in other words, is perhaps not, I don't think would be seen in most traditions of Christianity that I'm familiar with, as welcome, I suppose, as a participant or officiant in this type of into this type of service. But Justinian, I think, and the history seems to show this, respected her quite a great deal, and she was very directly involved in his reign in a lot of important ways. Anyways, the same type of stylistic tendencies are present here: focus on pattern, two-dimensionality, rich color, and a certain sort of static, and what our historians describe as hieratic presentation, which is to say very frontal and very distant, as though one is in a very indefinite space and time. The next image that I want to look at very, very quickly is, I like the St. Apollinaris, but what I would do is skip over to the Transfiguration of Jesus. By the time we come into the 6th century, later in the 6th century, we can very clearly see this sort of dissociation from identifiable locations, identifiable regions in space and time. The Transfiguration is taking place now on a sort of green-yellow strip, more like a ground line than an actual space. And the background is this shimmering, again, radiant, luminous gold. Christ appears in this is a mandorla, this almond-shaped space right here, as a kind of otherworldly, almost spectral presence, divorced, I think, from our typical perceptions of a sort of flesh and blood character. And I think this is a very common tendency in Byzantine art going forward, as we can see, especially in examples like this right here, also from St. Catherine, this icon image. Icons were small painted surfaces, often done as this one was in caustic, which is colored wax on a wooden panel. Again, the sense of a distant and kind of eternal somewhat unreal, at least in our sort of everyday experience, unreal forms with staring eyes facilitates a kind of communication between the here and now, the sort of flesh and blood secular world that we live in, and the spiritual world in which these icon figures exist. It also highlights a pretty significant difference in terms of the role of images in Byzantine art, the sense that one is supposed to interact with them, and in a real sense render homage and adoration to the image in the sense that it communicates with another sort of spiritual realm. And I think that that's a very important thing to think of as we go forward into the Western tradition. Coming into painting, especially in the 14th century, and some of the controversies that arise with the use of religious images. In the Eastern tradition, image use is very, very common. If we look at this particular mosaic here from the Hagia Sophia, we want to remember that the Hagia Sophia is taken over by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and a great deal of the ornament that is now absent in the Hagia Sophia is only alluded to in this mosaic here of the Virgin, the Theotokos, essentially the bearer of God. This gives us a very small taste of what the interior of that Hagia Sophia would have looked like. This dating probably a little bit more in the 9th century. It gives a sense of the continuity of the Byzantine tradition and the sense of a very clearly established type, as it were, for images of the Madonna or the Child or saints or what have you. Something that continues into far field locations like Hosius Lucas, again, St. Luke, moving into the 11th century, this beautiful remote monastery, again with a central plan dome design reminiscent on a much smaller scale of Hagia Sophia. We see, as we look into this space right here, a beautiful dome mosaic of Christ as Pantocrator, that is to say, ruler of all. We can see again the pendentives, squinches, these little apses in the corners of the square. And if we look a little more closely, a really striking, stern, severe, and remote image of Jesus. If we look at this image here of the crucifixion from the Church of the Dormition in Daphne, that Byzantine taste for flattened forms, stylized folds in the drapery, that gold background makes itself abundantly clear. The style that Byzantine artists created as we left, say, the 11th or 12th century persists in large measure in both in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, but also as far west as Venice, as this interior of St. Mark's very clearly shows, and persists in unexpected ways, I think, very late into our period. A good example of this would be to look at this image here from Sicily and Monreale, but even more interestingly, in this from the Paris Psalter, this image of David composing the Psalms as we're in the 10th century. We see that Byzantine art provide a really important vector for the transmission of classical ideas, representations of the human figure, focus on light and shade, even as some of the mosaics and other images that we've seen before sought to undermine that sense of three-dimensional modeling, especially in illuminated manuscripts and icons. The understanding of and representation of three-dimensional forms as we visually experience them was in large part, I think, helped along by the persistent survival of Byzantine forms. So if we look, for instance, at something like this, this is a Russian icon from the 11th or 12th century. That is a good example of the sort of two directions between the Paris Psalter and this more two-dimensional form, both of which, again, have a huge impact, especially on Italian painting as we come into the 13th and 14th centuries.